Hi everyone, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology bringing you another chart reading. And today I'm going to be looking at the chart of Al Franken. If you want to follow along, he was born on May 21st, 1951 in New York, New York. And we do have a birth time of 6:15 p.m. So Al Franken has an interesting chart. He is a Gemini sun at 0 degrees, conjunct Mars at 0 degrees as well. So if we just take Sun and Mars conjunct in Gemini, this is going to be somebody who is very passionate about their thoughts and their beliefs. They're going to be a communicator, and their communication is going to have a lot of enthusiasm behind it. It's going to have a lot of strength behind it. It's, Mars is the warrior, and so that energy is conjunct his identity in the sign of Gemini, of communication. So basically he's going to be somebody who has a lot to say, who is very passionate about what he has to say. Now, what is also interesting about his chart is that Moon-Mars conjunction in Gemini is opposite that Sun-Mars conjunction in Gemini is opposite his moon in Sagittarius at 9 degrees. So this means that he was born at a full moon time. And if you think about full moon energy, it's very highly energized. If you think about full moon times, this is the time of the month that he was born. And a lot of times people that have full moon births, their energy can be very polarized. So sometimes they're expressing the Sun-Mars energy, or just in this case, let's say the Sun energy in Gemini, which is the communicator, identifying through their communication, radiating through their communication, their purpose being connected to their ability to communicate. But then on the other side, they may swing towards this lunar sort of subconscious, reactive, instinctual expression in this Sagittarian way, which has more to do with the broader perspective, having philosophies, and in some ways nurturing or supporting others through these philosophical perspectives, feeling secure through being able to see the bigger picture of things, rather than just all the facts, which is more mercurial, more Gemini. Sagittarius is the broader perspective, how we can see a grander vision of purpose in life. So to have the full moon birth in mutable signs is probably one of the easier energies to deal with, but there's of the full moon energy, but there's still this kind of swinging back and forth between, being very solar and then swinging to that more lunar expression of ourselves. And this could be somebody with Moon and Sag who really kind of, feels like they instinctively want to kind of share with everybody, how they think about the larger picture. That is the way they may nurture others, but they also may have a bit of an attachment to kind of feeling like they've got the answer, or they've got it figured out, or they figured out, or they know the perspective on things. Now, what's also interesting in his chart is that he's got his Venus and Uranus conjunct in his chart. So his Venus is at 12 degrees Cancer and his Uranus is at 7 degrees Cancer. And I also want to note, and we'll get into this in a moment, that Venus-Uranus is part of a T-square in his chart. The Venus-Uranus, actually it's more specifically just the Uranus, opposes Chiron at 1 degree Capricorn in his chart. And then both of those energies, the Venus-Uranus and the Chiron, square Jupiter at 6 degrees Aries in his chart. So let's just start with the Venus-Uranus. And I also want to note that the Venus-Uranus squares Neptune at 17 degrees Libra. So I will talk about that first before I get into the T-square. Because I think that this combination of all of these energies I just mentioned is part of the reason why he's finding himself in the situation that he's in. Now, of course, there are transits that are happening and solar arcs that are happening that are kind of setting things off, or that are happening at the same time as this energy is being set off in his chart. But I think just starting with Venus-Uranus, Venus has to do with our pleasure-seeking principle. You know, what brings us pleasure? And in Cancer, you know, that might be things that make us feel comfortable, like being at home or being around women. You know, that Cancer rules the sign of women. Things that make us feel nurtured. That's what brings us pleasure with Venus in Cancer. But what's interesting is that Uranus is there. And Uranus is kind of the opposite of Cancer in the sense that it's freedom seeking. It wants no boundaries, no barriers, no borders. You know, it really just wants to be free. So to have your loving nature, your desire principle, things that make you feel good next to Uranus just makes kind of a different take on the Venusian principle. It's really somebody who has to figure out how to seek pleasure while at the same time also experiencing the freedom that they desire. And, you know, this could be somebody who potentially may at times not recognize the boundaries and the borders around getting that pleasure-seeking principle fulfilled. But ultimately, Uranus is about knowledge and insight and understanding how we are all individuals, but we are all individuals within the group. And that's why it relates to humanity. So over time, you know, Uranus brings those awarenesses that we have to, even though maybe we feel so individualistic, we have to recognize that our individuality has to honor and encompass humanity, the whole, in its expression. So, you know, that energy just might be kind of a lifetime of learning that he is here to experience with this desire principle combined with this principle of freedom and I can do whatever I want kind of energy. Now, that Venus-Uranus in Cancer squares his Neptune at 17 degrees Libra. And when we have Venus squaring Neptune, you know, this probably gives him that ability to be in the limelight, to be the comedian, to be the politician, because Neptune, any personal planet that's aspected by Neptune can deal with glamour. Neptune can deal with this idealization. And oftentimes it can be projected onto us when we have Neptune connected to our personal planets. So people may see us in a certain way, you know, and they may you know, project onto us that we are kind of this idealized version of ourselves, which isn't always necessarily true. And we can do the same when we have Neptune connected to Venus. We can project onto others this idealization of who we want them to be, and then we find ourselves in these relationships with people that we end up, you know, trying to prop up or support or fix or heal, because when the illusion kind of fades, you know, we kind of are stuck with the reality of like who somebody really is rather than like who we thought they were, or, you know, the fact that we wanted to try to change them into something that we thought they could be. So the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think just sometimes Neptune can cause confusion. Neptune can cause just illusion. And perhaps with that Venus-Uranus, because one thing I didn't mention, and I want to read from Sue Tompkins' Aspects in Astrology, what she has to say about people who have Venus-Uranus aspects She talks about it as saying, whatever the actual aspect, people with these contacts often radiate lots of sparkle and personal magnetism. People gravitate to Venus Uranus like moths to a light, for they often have a very electric quality. So he just naturally has people drawn to him. Then with this Neptune in the picture, it's like, people are projecting, glamour onto him and this idealization, and or he may be doing the same to others that he finds in his field. So it can just create overall kind of like this potential like lack of boundaries and potential sometimes we give in to the things that are presented to us, especially in that illusory light of glamour. It's like we may even take advantage of those opportunities, especially if we've got Venus Uranus, which at its lesser expression may not know where the boundaries are, may not have a good idea of where boundaries are, and is just more about like freedom, and then with Neptune kind of like confusing things, and it's like, well, maybe this person does want my attention, maybe they do want me to. It's just it's a scenario for confusion, for lack of boundaries. And then here's the other piece of it. Jupiter in Aries squaring that Uranus-Venus conjunction as well. Jupiter, expansion, growth, ultimately knowledge and understanding. But in Aries is like, the first sign of the zodiac. It's like springtime, it's fire. And sometimes Aries can act before it even thinks. That's part of its downfall. It's like it doesn't have great forethought always. It's just sort of instinctual. So perhaps with Jupiter in this equation, Jupiter can just make things bigger sometimes. So it could just be amplifying this energy of the Venus-Uranus squared Neptune in his chart. And I need to insert a caveat here. I am not excusing any form of sexual harassment or any form of crossing boundaries. But I do feel that every situation of sexual harassment can be looked at on an individual basis, especially, through looking at somebody's chart astrologically, and we can begin to understand the nuances of why somebody may be behaving in the way that they have behaved. Again, doesn't excuse the behavior, but at the same time, I think astrology just helps us recognize that, we are all on this planet learning lessons. I think the statement in the Bible might be, basically the person who casts the first stone needs to make sure that they're basically free of any kind of sin, that they've accomplished or that they've done in their life. And I think that's what astrology can help us do. It doesn't mean that there don't need to be repercussions. That's Saturn. Saturn is about karma. Saturn's about the law, that we have to, in some ways, kind of right our wrongs. But I'm just saying that the chart helps us see where some people's behavior may be coming from. And I want to discuss this T-square in his chart. And this has to do with his Venus-Uranus again being squared by Jupiter, but then the Venus-Uranus is opposed Chiron, which is also squared by Jupiter. Now I want to talk about his Chiron in Capricorn. Chiron and Capricorn, if you think about Capricorn, Capricorn's about our work. It's about creating structure in our life. It's about our ability to succeed in the material world. Well, this is where his wound is. Chiron. Chiron in Capricorn. A wound around our ability to become successful. And it can really drive somebody, it can really make somebody want to work extra hard to succeed, because they equate worth with that, how much they succeed. Now, really the healing with Chiron and Capricorn comes with learning that it isn't so much about the tangible things per se. I mean, you always probably will seek that with Chiron and Capricorn, but it's where the desire for that success is coming from. Is it truly in alignment with our inner guidance, with our inner truth? Or is it about how much can we acquire? How much fame can we succeed? Because ultimately, if that's the impetus and that's the drive, we're always going to feel like we need more. We're going to feel empty. So there's a healing that has to happen around the Chiron in Capricorn. And I want to quickly read what Martin Lass has to say about the healing aspect of having Chiron in Capricorn. And he says, the gift is recognition, acknowledgement, and appreciation of who we are, exactly as we have been divinely designed to be. The recognition, acknowledgement, and appreciation of the wisdom of our inner voice / inspiration, and the gift of sharing our wisdom and understanding with others. The discovery of our vocation in line with our divine design, our life's path, purpose, calling, and destiny. So there's something going on with his Chiron opposite his Uranus Venus. It's like his wound has been about, I need to succeed, you know, but then opposite it, and part of that needing to succeed is like having a reputation, you know, being an authority, of always doing the right thing, because that's Saturnian, you know. But then there's this other part of him opposite his Chiron is this Venus and Uranus that's just like, woo, you know, like freedom. I'm going to fulfill all my desires with, you know, and I don't care about anybody else. I mean, that's kind of like this dynamic in him that he's been having to operate under. And then with the Jupiter and Aries squaring both of those energies, the Chiron opposite the Uranus Venus, Jupiter and Aries is again just kind of like it is about philosophy and understanding, you know, but it can be in Aries, it can be sort of like, again, this kind of like, I'm going to do what I want, you know, I'm going to expand in the ways that I want that are self-serving, you know. So there's this interesting dynamic in this T-square in his chart that he's had to kind of wrestle with in his life about, you know, what's the right thing to do versus like these impulsive, almost like, you know, no boundaries and getting my own needs met at the expense of others kind of energy. Now, it's the time to mention here a few things that have been going on with his chart by transit and by solar arc. He has been having Mars and Jupiter in Scorpio moving through his 12th house. And the 12th house, well, let's just first take Jupiter in Scorpio. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. It's about expansion. It's about new understanding. You know, it's about our philosophies, how we choose to live our life, you know, our morals, the wisdom that guides our life. In Scorpio, it's been in the sign of Scorpio. Scorpio is about going deep and uncovering our kind of like hidden, unconscious drives in order to bring light to them so that we can be set free and no longer have to be controlled by them. And this energy, Mars and Scorpio, Jupiter and Scorpio, has been moving through his 12th house of the unconscious as well. They call this house the house of self-undoing. So Mars, I keep saying Mars because Mars has been there too. Both Mars and Jupiter have been going through his 12th house and like rotor-rooting it. You know, rotor-rooting his life of these things that he may not even have been fully aware of. And they're saying, no longer can you, behave in these ways. It's time to change. Both of those planets have been in that 12th house of the unconscious and self-undoing. And, you know, when you've got Mars in the 12th house, Mars wants action, but it's action in the unconscious, you know. And Jupiter wants to expand and bring new perspectives and philosophies. But again, it's about those areas of of the unconscious. And both in the sign of Scorpio just means even more going deep and plumbing the depths and bringing things to the surface. So that's part of what's been going on in his chart. I also wanted to quickly show you that on November 16th, when the first allegations came out about Al Franken and sexual misconduct, Jupiter was exactly on his ascendant at 8 degrees Scorpio. So I just find that fascinating. I mean, Jupiter does indicate luck and fortune, but you know, when it's in the sign of Scorpio, it's kind of weird because it's like, ultimately this may be good fortune for him because he will have an opportunity to grow from this all, but just because you have Jupiter going over your ascendant doesn't necessarily mean it's all going to be like, you know, positivity. You have to look at the sign that it's in, and it happened to be in Scorpio. It still is, but on that day, going right over his ascendant. So really, you know, ushering in, well, I should say this. If our ascendants are about like how we bring ourselves out into the world, the way that we interface with others, it's kind of like the mask that we wear as we interface with people. You know, he I should say, with that Jupiter and Scorpio, it was like a new philosophies in Scorpio, which is like facing the truth, was combining with his ascendant energy, with how he brings himself out into the world. And that's certainly, you know, how he handled it. He did not try to deny it. Now, he has since then said there's been some discrepancy between the way he remembers certain events and the way other women are remembering certain things. But in regards to the very first woman, he flat out said, this is what happened, and, you know, I sincerely apologize. So I just find that interesting that Jupiter went over his ascendant that exact day that first allegation came out, and it's reflective of, in some ways, a philosophical way of being that he integrated with his personality or his persona, which is our ascendant, which was very scorpionic, you know, to really face the truth and to really expose oneself and to, you know, kind of come out with a philosophy that was very truthful. And I think it's worth mentioning that today Mars shortly will be moving across his ascendant around the 22nd, 23rd of December, which it's interesting because I don't think he's actually announced exactly when he's going to be resigning from the Senate. So perhaps as Mars moves over that first house cusp, he may come out and make that announcement. And I want to mention a few other things. He has been having transiting Saturn, squaring his Saturn. And as we know, Saturn's been in the sign of Sagittarius, and it's been squaring his Saturn at 25 degrees Virgo. So anytime, you know, we're dealing with a Saturn transit, it's interesting because Saturn moves so slowly. It hasn't been in a square position to his Saturn in 15 years. And so whenever we're dealing with Saturn transits, it does bring in an element of karma, of kind of, Saturn can be called the great eliminator, where it just brings up stuff that we have to look at and we have to make decisions. And with his Saturn in Virgo, you know, Saturn in Virgo is somebody who, you know, works very, is very detail oriented and was really very service oriented and very humble. You know, with Saturn in Sag wants to expand our perspective. You know, Saturn in Sag wants to, where we have to work to expand our perspective too. So this can just mean that he's been, being shown where, he needs to basically, understand more in relationship to how he creates structure, how he creates foundation in his life, especially around the areas of values, because that's the house that Saturn has been transiting in his chart while it's been squaring his natal Saturn in Virgo out of the 11th house. Now, what's also going to happen is that Saturn is going to move into Capricorn on the 19th of December, and it's going to come right across his Chiron. And this happens every 30 years. So another symbol of him really having to perhaps look at his wounded energy and take more responsibility for how he may be operating from a wounded place in his life, maybe how, and again, that Capricorn Chiron is a part of that opposition to his Uranus Venus conjunction, setting off the square from the Neptune to the Uranus Venus. So it's going to be bringing up perhaps, how he's equated maybe his behavior and the liberties he's taken with his behavior, how he's equated that with maybe what he feels he's owed, or what, he feels somebody in his place, in his stature, in his place of authority, with the reputation that he has, with the recognition that he has, is just kind of allowed to have, or allowed to do. But Capricorn Chiron is about our reputation, and it is about not being swayed by the ideas of fame and fortune and all of that, and really being in alignment with an expression of our truth as we pursue and seek those material things in our life. So again, just another interesting transit that is going to be coming up for him at this time, while he's obviously going to be and has been, going through this kind of clearing out process of habits, unconscious behaviors, liberties that he's been in some ways kind of abusing. And another thing to point out too is Saturn is a 30-year cycle, and we can break it down into 15-year cycles where it's going up the right side of the chart for 15 years and down the right side of the chart for 15 years. And he is in the process of Saturn going down the right side of the chart. And he still has another 5 years for Saturn to reach the very bottom of his chart. But often, because Saturn's about lessons and learning, Saturn going down that left side of the chart, we can experience lessons in our life that really do help us grow and do help us create a more solid foundation in our life. And then once that Saturn begins to go up the right side of the chart, then we can go out into the world with our new understanding and our new foundation and begin to build on that with people, in the outer world. But Saturn going down the left chart for 15 years is really more of an interning time, learning more and learning those lessons. And this is just another pattern that he happens to be in at this time. So the last few things I want to talk about happen to be with his progressions. And he has right now the progressed sun at 3 degrees Leo, beginning to square his natal Mercury, which is at 4 degrees Taurus. So his Mercury thinking, in Taurus, practical thinking. This is somebody who generally can kind of have a level head about things. With this progression of the sun beginning to square his Mercury in Taurus, his Mercury is his star of destiny. So whenever anything happens to his Mercury, it's like more significant in his life. With the progressed Sun, his identity, in Leo, wanting to shine, wanting to, be in some ways kind of grand and be, very full of pride and be seen in a very positive way, squaring his thinking in Taurus. Taurus is ruled by Venus. It's ruled by our pleasures, So again, we have to look to where his Venus is in his chart. It's conjunct that Uranus. It's opposite the Chiron. It's squared by the Neptune. So really that mercurial way in Taurus of thinking perhaps is going to begin to be undergoing, some sort of integration with his Sun and progressed Sun in Leo, really wanting to be in some ways just seen in a better light, seen in a better way, And at the same time, his progressed Mercury, which right now is at 29 Leo, the last degrees of Leo, is going to be moving into a square with his Sun at 0 degrees Gemini. So that progressed Mercury will eventually move into the sign of Virgo, and that will be squaring his natal Sun at 0 degrees Gemini. So progressed Mercury in Virgo, that is like really thinking in ways that are very precise and again very practical, but they're about putting, it's thinking in ways of putting things in order, thinking in ways really of also how to be of service and thinking in ways of being humble, and that energy is going to be squaring his Sun in Gemini, so it might just be beginning to cause him to kind of think, well, that Sun in Gemini is just kind of like, oh, I'll go here and I'll go there and I'll do this and I'll do that. It's very mutable, very changeable, not always like the most thinking about other people and other, it just moves on, That's Gemini. It's the butterfly of the zodiac. So this Mercury in Virgo is going to perhaps begin to want to bring a new way of thinking, of grounding the thinking, because it's an earth energy, Virgo. Even though it's ruled by Mercury, it's an earth energy. And so perhaps it will just, help him integrate a new way of thinking more practically, a little more humbly, in ways of how he could be of service. That will hopefully kind of like counter some of that Sun in Gemini sort of like flitting from here to there and not really thinking so much about how you're impacting those around you per se, because Gemini just is air. It moves on. It goes this way, it goes that way. But Virgo's like, let's think practically, let's think about how we're, affecting others in certain ways. So those are two big progressions that are going to be happening in his chart. And I feel like I could talk forever about his chart, but I also don't want to make this video too long. I think I've hit the big points. A couple of other things. I mean, Jupiter in Scorpio has been trining his Venus, and this is a positive thing, bringing new perspective into his desire nature, his loving nature. But it also could be why this information has been coming out at this time, because his Venus is at 12 degrees Cancer, and Jupiter will be at 12 degrees Scorpio it was around the 3rd and 4th and 5th of December. I don't know exactly when these allegations came out, but it's interesting to me that Jupiter has been trining his Venus at this time, because it could just have been sort of bringing out this overextension and this overexpansion of that Venusian principle that's been operating in his life. Well, I think I'm going to leave it there and just say thank you very much for listening to my chart interpretation of Al Franken. And also, if you're interested in readings, I do read charts, and you can reach me at lindsayc73@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. And if you also are enjoying my videos, please subscribe. Thanks so much. Adios.